Is a boundary a rule? That's a really great question because people tell me all the time, well, my boundaries don't work and people don't respect my boundaries. So it doesn't do any good to set boundaries. And yeah, when you're dealing with difficult people who don't respect your boundaries, what I call boundary busters, a lot of times they don't. But the misconception that a boundary is a rule that people have to obey is what gets people mixed up. A boundary is not a rule, okay? Imagine telling an alcoholic with a drink in his or her hand, you can't have that drink. Do you think that alcoholic is going to take it and put that down and say, oh, sorry, I didn't know I couldn't have that? No, the alcoholic is not going to listen to your rule that says you can't have that in this house, right? Oh, yes, I can. And watch me, right? Here I am. And watch me have another one. That's what an alcoholic is going to do. So you're going to not have effective boundaries if you run around making rules for people. So let's look at the difference between a boundary and a rule. So here's a rule. You will be home at 6 p.m. for dinner. Now, you might be able to tell a child that dinner time is at 6 p.m., be home at 6 p.m., and then have a consequence if the child isn't home at 6 p.m. But can you tell an adult to be home at 6 p.m.? No. You cannot tell your husband or your wife or a parent or maybe even an adult child in your home. You're not going to tell that person you have to be home at 6 p.m. So a rule is you will have to be home at 6 p.m. It's something that someone is supposed to follow. A boundary is, I will serve dinner at 6 p.m. If you're home, you can eat with me. So a boundary focuses not on you, on the other person, but on me, on yourself, what you will do. It's going to say, I will or I will not. That is a boundary. I will or I will not. What are you going to do? You want to serve dinner at 6 o'clock? What are you going to do if the person's not there at 6 o'clock? If people are not there, are you still going to serve dinner? That's where your boundary comes in. Your boundary, not the other person's behavior. Your boundary, okay? Here's another example. Rule, you cannot drive when you are drinking. How are you going to enforce that? You cannot enforce that, okay? Now, if you've got a teenager and you think the teenager is drinking when driving, you can keep the keys away, okay? But you still cannot tell that kid that you cannot drink while you're driving because that kid can get in somebody else's car and do it, or that adult child, or your spouse, or your parent, or your sibling can get in somebody else's car and drive, or their own car and drive if you're not around, right? So again, that is your rule. You cannot drive when you are drinking. Here is your boundary. I will not ride with you when you are drinking. That you can control. You can decide if you're going to get in the car. If you've been out with that person and that person's drinking, don't get in the car. Get another ride, okay? Here's another one. Rule, you cannot yell at me. How do you enforce that? Do you close a person's mouth? Do you put your hand over their mouth when they're starting to yell at you? You cannot tell another person, you cannot yell at me, because yes, they can. The person can yell at you. He or she can yell. Watch them. You cannot yell at me. Watch me yell. Try telling somebody who's yelling at you, in the process of yelling at you, don't yell. I've tried it. It doesn't work, right? Okay, here is the boundary. I will not, remember that? I will not. I will not. I will not continue the conversation with you when you are yelling. Done. You start yelling, I can't control your yelling, I'm out of here. I'm done with the conversation. Can I control that? 100%. Next one. Rule, you have to get a job to live at home. Okay, how do you enforce that? I had one dad ask me, how do I get my son to keep a job? I have gotten him 3 jobs and he's managed to lose every one, to get fired from every one. How do you make somebody get a job? It's hard. If you've tried it, you know it's difficult. If that person does not want to get a job, all they have to do is say, I'm looking, I'm waiting, I applied, and nothing happens. And how do you know if they've looked, if they've applied? You don't know. Okay, so here's the boundary. I will allow you to live at home if you are working. Can you control that? I hope so, because if you make it as a boundary, you should follow through. The only way that that child is allowed to live at home is if the child is working. Okay? You can live at home. I will allow you to live at home if you're working. So, rule. You can't ask me to go to the store for you more than once a week. Now, I know a lot of people who tell me that in dealing with their elderly parents who have become unable to drive for themselves and do things that they're very demanding. Sometimes elderly people get very demanding and self-centered in their old age without realizing their world shrinks, and that automatically makes them more self-focused. And they think, oh, when I need something, I need it. And they don't realize that your life is still out here with all this stuff, and they're calling and asking you to go to the store to pick up Band-Aids. And then the next day they're asking you to go to the store and pick up one thing. So you can't control how much that person's going to ask you to do for them. You cannot. So there's no rule. You can only ask me to go to the store once a week, because a person can ask you 100 times a day if they want to. The boundary is, I will go to the store for you once a week. Okay, so I'm going to keep a list. When you call, I'll write it on the list, and once a week, I'll go to the store and get everything. You can control that. Or I'll go to the store for you twice a week. Or I'll pick things up for you at the store when I'm at the store. So that you can control. Okay, the last one. You cannot expect me to talk to you on the phone every day for an hour. How do you control how much somebody expects you to talk? Can you make a rule about that? No. You cannot say to someone, you can't expect me, because the person can just turn around and say, but I do. I do expect you to. Changing people's expectations is very difficult. You're not going to get anywhere. What is the boundary? I will talk to you for as long as I can. I have control about that, right? I'll talk to you for as long as I can. If I need to go, I'm going to discontinue the conversation. And do you discontinue it? You can anytime that you need to. You don't have to talk to anybody for any specific length of time. You can say, I'm done, I need to go. And then you hang up the phone. Okay, gotta go. And then you have complete control. So do you see the pattern? You see the pattern with boundaries. Boundaries are, I will or I will not. Rules are, you have to, and the person does not. So don't make rules for adults. Make boundaries. What you will do, decide, what am I willing to do? What am I not willing to do? State it, follow through. You've got boundaries, and they work. And they're 100% in your control, which means you can make sure they work because you're the one that puts the action to the rules to enforce your boundary. So I hope that makes sense. Romans 14:12 says, so then each of us will give an account of himself to God. That kind of goes along with having our own boundaries. And Galatians 6:4-5, each one should test his own actions. Then he can take pride in himself without comparing himself to somebody else, for each one should carry his own load. So in other words, we're talking about ourselves. What are we willing to do? What are you yourself willing to do? Not what the other person is doing, but you yourself. So I have just given you the ability to have effective boundaries in your life. Simple. That's all there is to it, is figuring out what are you willing to do and what are you not willing to do. So thank you for watching this video on Change My Relationship.